Hello, welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's political talk show. Amongst the important anniversaries marked in Lebanon Monday were the passing of 1 year since President Michel Sleiman left office, in addition to 365 days of non-stop talk and no action on electing a successor. Politicians of all types, as well as representatives of civil society and people in the street, have made their views known. The 1 year mark came amid few signs that the vacancy would be addressed soon, but pessimism is on the rise, and Lebanon has been dubbed the Republic of Shame. Meanwhile, Hezbollah is doomed to fail in Qalamun and throughout Syria, and that's according to Abu Muhammad al-Golani, the leader of the Nusra Front, as he said in a televised interview with Al Jazeera. Al-Golani predicted that Hezbollah would be defeated after the imminent collapse of the Syrian government. And most importantly, facts and figures tell us it might soon be too late to address a major dilemma in the country, namely the refugee crisis and developments related to their underdeveloped lives. Let me first welcome our guest here at the studio, Mr. Joseph Barakat of the Lebanese Forces in London. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you for having us.
And we will be having and welcoming other guests in due course. Before we delve into our discussion today, let's have a look at this brief report by Saima Jafar.
As Lebanon marked 1 year since its presidential vacuum, United Nations Special Coordinator for Lebanon, Sigrid Kaag, urged the country's feuding political leaders to pick a new president. Kaag stressed that the vacuum had hindered the country's ability to tackle growing security, economic and social problems. Lebanese Prime Minister Tamam Salam also warned that the year-long presidential vacuum is threatening the country's existence, as Christian March 14 lawmakers lobbied the Maronite Patriarch Bashar al-Assad's support to reduce the quorum required for an electoral parliament session. Addressing the nation on the 1 year anniversary of the presidential deadlock, Salam warned that the continued vacuum in the top Christian post put the country's very existence into jeopardy and caused heavy damage to Lebanon's sectarian coexistence formula. The presidency has fallen victim to political deadlock rooted in Lebanese rivalries that have been complicated by competition between regional states, notably Iran and Saudi Arabia, which have a decisive influence over regional politics. A country of just over 4 million people, Lebanon is also overwhelmed with the influx of Syrian refugees fleeing the war. UN Special Envoy for Global Education Gordon Brown has backed a $100 million call for the international community to fund formal public education for 100,000 more Syrian refugee children in Lebanon, with 4 months to the start of the new school year. According to UNHCR estimates, there are nearly 400,000 school-aged children refugees in Lebanon. Meanwhile, Hezbollah's chief Hassan Nasrallah has addressed the nation for the third time in a month, insisting that his fighters would expand their presence in Syria. While Lebanon is officially neutral on the conflict next door, the country has been unable to escape the effects of the war.
Mr. Barakat, some argue that the actual Lebanese Christian parties that complain most about this deadlock when it comes to the presidential vacuum are the ones that caused this mess, as per the journalists in top newspapers in Lebanon. That's what they're saying. Tell us more about this.
I don't think that's truth. What caused this mess is the influence of Hezbollah on the politics in Lebanon and the way they dictate.
Hezbollah being the main player in this?
The main player in that game, and there is evidence that even the Iranian ambassador was called off few months before the end of term of President Suleiman. Knowing the Iranians, I think they knew that will be no election for a new president in Lebanon. So this is why they had to send an ambassador beforehand, because if they kept it to the time that should have been done, then will be no president to receive this ambassador.
I see.
So that's the reason that I say that, because Hezbollah interfered in Syria, in the war in Syria, without referring to anybody else in Lebanon. And it suits Hezbollah not to have a president holding power and managing the crisis through the institutions of Lebanon. So the country with the institutions are practically non-existing. The only president with the real power at the moment is the chief of parliament, Mr. Nabih Berri, who's a Syrian ally and an ally of Hezbollah. So every time, if they allow their MPs to come to the parliament, the election would have taken place and the president would have been elected.
Now, in an editorial in a top renowned newspaper in Lebanon, the editorial notes that MPs representing Christian parties forget that the concept of duties accompanies the concept of rights. So if they demand more rights as a Christian community, they should do their duties to elect their president.
Absolutely. Wrongly, they were saying that we are practicing our democratical right by not attending the session of the parliament to elect president. That's wrong. That's totally wrong. Matter of fact, I think it's a crime. This is a crime against the law and against the institution, and it's a betrayal to the voters who voted for them. The first duty, or one of the main duties of the MP, is to transmit the vote of the voters to elect a president. They could have attended, they could have voted to whoever they wanted to vote for, or they could have even not vote at all, but attended the session.
But maybe they were trying to sabotage in a more obvious way to make it clear that they can stop this from happening. And that's what they're doing, maybe? And is that not democratic?
Well, they can stop. I mean, they've proven that they could stop that from happening, but that's very unlawful. In any other country, MPs would practice the same way of electing a president. They would have been in jail or sacked of their jobs. That's totally illegal. All that even our president, Dr. Samir Jaja,
the president of the Lebanese forces.
President of the Lebanese forces,
Yes.
who put his name as a candidate for the presidential
He was
election.
a candidate,
Yeah.
yes.
And he said openly, whoever comes to the parliament and wins the vote, I'll be the first one to go and shake his hand and congratulate him. So really, it's not equal responsibility between the MPs that never turn up to the parliament and the MPs that turn up to the parliament every time to vote to elect president.
Yes.
I mean, there are some of the MPs, Christian MPs, that they took their responsibility very serious, and they're attending to their duties every time, and some of them declined and refused and came out with all sorts of excuses to boycott the session.
And now we are joined by Nadim Baye, Lebanese political commentator and medical student joining us from Amiens in France. Welcome to our discussion.
Thank you, Carl. It's a pleasure to be on your TV show today.
Nadim, what are in your opinion, the most important points in Hassan Nasrallah's speech this week?
To answer your question, the recent speech of Nasrallah didn't bring anything new compared to what he has already said 2 weeks ago about the ongoing war in Syria. But it was another very important speech because it sent messages to his allies and opponents as well. As the battle hasn't started yet, so he talked to Sunnis, Shias and Christians as well, calling for unity against barbarism and terrorism. Because it's a phenomenon that's affecting the whole region of the Middle East. So everybody is concerned by fighting terrorism, as much as Bush administration did after 9/11. So I think that this was a call for neighbors to take on responsibility, regardless of the divergence about Syria and Assad's regime. In my opinion, Nasrallah is being wise when he calls on everyone in the Arab world, and particularly in Lebanon, to denounce Daesh or al-Nusra, which is just not to be forgotten, Al-Qaeda's branch in Syria.
Yes, and while Nasrallah views the battle against ISIS as an existential battle, some people who were on the ground in Syria and spoken to local residents there believe that ISIS is not as widespread in the country in Syria, and it's simply a resistance aiming at a change of government in Syria, a change of rule even. So, do you agree?
ISIS controls half of Syria. How can you explain the expansion of the Islamic State from Iraq to Syria, from Mosul to Palmyra and southern Syria in just a few weeks? Is this fiction? I don't think so. So people who say there are no extremists and terrorists in Syria are really lying to the world. So if you can let me just to tell you a little story about a woman reported one visit, and she came back to Lebanon, and the city was Islam is free, but she went to visit and she was free. So I asked her, and she never replied. And we see photos of the hearings and executions every day posted on the internet, and it's accessible for everyone. So if you keep closing your eyes, you see nothing, but it doesn't mean the reality has gone or changed. So the war in Syria is about a last standing regime, or the fall of stronghold, or a fight for freedom. It's about a regional plan that was issued many years ago in order to collapse nations and turning them to small puzzle pieces, like ex-Yugoslavia, for example.
And Nadim, with Lebanon already being divided and weakened, with its political parties clashing over the Syria crisis and the toppling of Mr. Assad, now if Hezbollah continues to expand its presence in Syria, how would it be able to help maintain security in Lebanon, which is its main motive basically as a resistance to protect Lebanon from the Israeli threat? Nowadays we have a lot of refugees in Lebanon, and some of them could be compliant to what ISIS dictates. So do you think Hezbollah's presence in Syria will weaken it in Lebanon?
Well, first of all, everyone's concerned by this war, and nations must unite to fight terror in order to preserve the way of life of Lebanese, first of all, and Syrians and Iraqis, because it's a phenomenon of the regional phenomenon. So look what happened in Nimrod, for example. They are trying to erase history and civilization, although the Prophet of Islam never called followers on destroying culture and ruin. Which means ISIS isn't about Islam first and doesn't represent Muslims. I think Muslims have to understand this point because ISIS does not represent them. So about Syrian refugees in Lebanon, if they really support freedom fighters, as we call them, why then go to Syria? Why are they still in Lebanon? In my opinion, the majority of Syrians in Lebanon supports the Syrian majority and the Syrian government, and refuse to live under the reign of ISIS. So finally, I think maintaining Lebanon's security begins when all Lebanese stand together, facing terrorism and Austrian forces. Nothing could be done if Lebanon and Syria's borders were protected and fortified by militants fighting in Kalamoun. We don't have to forget that ISIS means the Islamic State in Iraq and Sham.
Yes.
And Sham means the Lebanon. So this region includes Lebanon and Syria. So in my opinion, Lebanese people have to think about the future and stand together to defend the nation and its existence, regardless of their opinion concerning Assad's
Nadim Baye joined us from Amiens in France. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Mr. Barakat, how could we assess the meeting in Bkirki, the see of the Maronite Patriarchate in Lebanon, where main Christian leaders gathered last week to discuss the presidency?
Actually, it's not just the presidency. There are many other issues that they are taking place at the moment in discussions. One of them is like the nationality for the Lebanese in diaspora abroad, where we know that the majority of those Lebanese are Christians, I'm sorry to say, and the right of voting, and as well there are...
Did they discuss this?
Yeah, they discussed many other issues among the presidential election. And I think Bkirki has the same point of view as us, as Lebanese forces. Go by the law. And if we're to go by the law, it means the MPs should attend the session and should vote.
Do you think there was a reason, sorry to interrupt, that only Christian figures were invited?
No, but the presidential election, though that is a Lebanese issue, is mainly as well a Christian issue. Because in Lebanon, as we all know, I mean, the Shiite get the parliament, the head of the parliament,
Yes.
and
The
prime minister
Sunnites
for the
get-
Sunnis,
yes.
and president is Christian, and that's really that what keeps the balance going, and that's what gives great sense of security to the country, because otherwise, this is why we now the country feels like it's lost, completely lost, lost directions, lost control, lost everything. Now, there are some parties, of course, as I said before, that they're profiting from the fact that there is no president. And they're trying to delay that as much as possible. Now, our question is, would they want Lebanon as an independent country with a president and prime minister and chief of parliament, or do they have any other project under the table? Because for the simple reason, Lebanon, it looks like, is the only country in the world where you have two armies.
You're talking about Hezbollah here.
Of course I'm talking about Hezbollah.
But there were other militias in the country before,
Yes, but at
including the
moment-
Lebanese forces,
Yeah,
obviously.
but that stage is gone. And Hezbollah, when he was carrying the operation of resistance against the Israelis, was fine. Up to it. Even ex-Prime Minister Sinura yesterday said it in the session of the about the tribunal about the
Special
Hariri-
tribunal for Lebanon, yes.
for Lebanon. And after that, these same weapons were used in different directions, like were used against other Muslims in Lebanon,
Yes.
and now they're used in wars in Syria, and as well Hezbollah is interfering in countries in the Gulf and the Middle East, which is reflecting very badly on the Lebanese abroad, and pushing the foreign minister into a corner where he doesn't like to be in. The question is, do we have a country and institutions, or do we not have that?
And back to Kirki, Mr. Barakat, do you think the Cardinal Bashar al-Rai, the Lebanese patriarch, could suggest simply during that gathering, I don't know if, I'm not sure he did behind the cameras, but do you think he's someone who would suggest a name? For the presidency?
I do not think he suggests a name. Maybe they exchange ideas or something like that. I'm not sure, because I'm not aware of that one, to be fair. But
do you think he should nominate at least, and then let them decide between those nominees?
I think it's very, very important that to have trustworthy president and capable president at the moment who can lead the country to safety. If we want like what they call it, a puppet, then it will have very, very negative effect on the chair itself, the chair of the president. Because now the whole country is looking at that post to save the country. Without a strong, powerful president who looks at the interest of Lebanon first, and Lebanon only first, then we're completely lost, as it's happening now. I mean, the effect of the involvement of the Hezbollah in the war in Syria is, and the refugee crisis in Lebanon, so disorganized and so messy, is causing huge problems for all the Lebanese. I mean, let's look at Lebanon in about 5 or 10 years from now, if we carry on going down the same road.
Mr. Barakat, let's touch a little bit on the other crisis in Lebanon, apart from the presidential void, the refugee status in Lebanon and their humanitarian suffering. Now, despite efforts from NGOs to alleviate those sufferings of the Syrian refugees, don't you think it's about time that the Lebanese government addressed the matter more seriously, working on a resettlement plan, perhaps, where other countries can take the burden of Lebanon, which has few resources, other countries, they could be in the West or in the region?
Indeed, and I think that issue is, as we say, it's better late than never. We prefer that to be happening, and sooner rather than later. I mean, every other country, they organized the issue of the refugees. They created camps. They created like hospitals on site, probably educational institutions on site. But the refugees, they have to stay within that area. Then on the understanding, once the situation settled down in their country, they can go back. Yeah. No doubt it's a heartbreaking humanitarian issue, but everybody knows that is straining very, very badly our infrastructure, our health institutions, our educational institutions, and the people of Lebanon themselves are worried about that issue.
Who would you suggest when it comes to Western countries that should make more of an effort? We've seen a shy effort from England taking a very few of the Syrian refugees. Do you think they should do better?
I personally think yes, not just England. The whole Western countries, the capable countries, they should share the burden because that's a humanitarian issue. And this is when we should step in and try to help, especially when we see that it's the whole large number of these refugees are crowding into a very small area with very minimal things provided for them, like no electricity, no water, no hospital, and stuff like that. We really feel for, and we as Lebanese, we've taken way more than we could have taken for to help. But I think there are limits to how much you can do.
Absorb. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now let's talk to someone in Beirut. I'd like to welcome Elena Slavova, Senior Advisor at International Alert in Lebanon. Welcome to our discussion.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us more, Elena, about the main things that challenge International Alert in its work in Lebanon, and how did you try to overcome those difficulties and challenges?
As a peace-building organization, Alert works in Lebanon to address some of the key root causes of conflict. These are, in particular, the presence of quite weak state institutions, low level of trust between the citizens and the state, and deep and pronounced political and sectarian divisions. What happened with the beginning of the Syrian crisis was that many of these fault lines have been deepened. On the one hand, the institutions have been put under strain to respond to the needs of over 1 million refugees. On the other hand, the political elite and the population have been increasingly more divided as they support different sides of the Syrian conflict. And there is also this new tension between the Lebanese communities and the Syrian refugees who have settled in these communities. International Alert works on all of these issues, and it engages with state institutions to make them more aware of the perceptions and expectations of their citizens. It also works on the community level to support initiatives that build trust between the Lebanese and the Syrian refugees. And lastly, but very important in the crisis situation, we work with UN agencies and humanitarian actors to make them more aware how their aid can have an impact on the tensions on the ground.
And how effective so far was engaging the Syrian diaspora in the UK? And are you aiming at the diaspora in other countries in the West, maybe America or Australia, or just the UK?
In the UK, we started engaging with the Syrian diaspora a year and a half ago, and it has been a really interesting experience. The Syrian diaspora platform is bringing together Syrians from different sides of the Syrian conflict divide, and it is there to respond to different needs of the diaspora community. It helps coordinate aid and humanitarian and development work which is being done for Syria. And it is also there to provide space for learning about peace building and about exploring different methods for different opportunities for building peaceful Syria. And one of the most interesting roles of the platform is engaging with policymakers and participating in the debate, bringing in a perspective from people who know the context and the historical background of the conflict well, and who can bring in more depth and complexity to the discussion. So far, this platform has been quite successful in highlighting key issues. Very recently, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office invited the platform to make a briefing and present key recommendations to the UN Special Envoy for the Syrian crisis. And there is quite a big interest in the platform as a unifying space of people staying on different sides of the conflict divide.
Yes, and stay with us, Elina. I will address Mr. Barakat here at the studio. Mr. Barakat, apart from the humanitarian crisis when it comes to the refugees, are you concerned as a political party in Lebanon about a demographic change perhaps in Lebanon, or a time when those refugees could be maneuvered politically, similar to what happened with the Palestinians during the civil war in Lebanon?
Of course, we are concerned about that issue. Bearing in mind that the number of the refugees coming from Syria through the Lebanese border in a very, very disorganized way exceeded the 20% of the population of Lebanon, which really...
It's a demographic threat.
Demographically creating a serious issue.
Yes.
The other issue is the poor Syrians, they've been used politically. For example, despite the fact that thousands and thousands of them flee Syria because of the fighting, and we saw like thousands of them managed to elect the same president who's involved in this war and causing in a big way this crisis.
Yes.
They managed to vote for him in Lebanon. So I mean, it's creating a bit.
That's what Elina said. Even the Lebanese are divided over the matter in Syria.
It's not clear at all on that issue. We know that because Hezbollah is supporting the Syrian regime and involved in the war in Syria, so he's got, of course, his allies from who are loyal to the Assad regime.
Yes.
On the other hand, you have the refugees that were oppressed by that regime, or they're fighting against this regime. And either way, the impact on Lebanon is very high and very strong, and is really beyond the capability of the country.
Elina, back to you. Are you hopeful the UN envoy for global education and former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown's initiative in Beirut yesterday will help improve educational needs for refugee children in Lebanon?
Yeah, Gordon Brown has been taking very active steps to bring the attention of the international community to the need for education of Syrian refugees. We should remember that there are 400,000 Syrian children in Lebanon who are in need of schooling. Right now, about 100,000 of them are in public schools. And Gordon Brown's initiative is advocating for funds for another 100,000 to be put in schools. This is, of course, a huge number, but it's not resolving the problem. There are other kids that cannot be accommodated currently in the public school system. Local organizations are taking steps to address this. There are multiple informal education initiatives, and they have recently started shifting from using the Syrian curriculum to using the Lebanese curriculum. This would allow the kids to sit the state exam here in Lebanon and potentially get a diploma. There are some other issues that Syrian children are facing in relation to education, and they're very important to bear in mind. One of them is the use of language in the Lebanese schools. Schools here rely heavily on English and French, something Syrian kids are not accustomed to. So this can be a barrier for many. There are also children who have been out of school for several years, up to 4 years, and they may need additional support, counseling to bring them back to the classroom.
And Elina, with deterring a spillover of the Syrian conflict into Lebanon being a big part of your work, how would you generally assess the rhetoric of the main political factions in Lebanon when it comes to reinstating this spillover and its imminent threat and working on avoiding it? Are they in the same mindset as you guys, as charities there?
Well, politicians usually tend to play on the fears and sentiments of their constituencies. It's common for every situation of conflict. So Lebanon is no different. Political elites are on different sides, and then they have different messages. What is interesting for us is that there is still quite, on some issues, there is a big disconnect between the political message and what the perceptions of the local Lebanese are. For example, when it comes to refugees being presented as a health hazard, this message was quite popular some time ago in the Lebanese public space, and yet the local Lebanese did not perceive such a threat. On the other hand, when it comes to perceptions of security, many Lebanese do fear that the Syrian refugee presence is creating concerns for their safety, concerns for the political and sectarian balance of the country. And when probed, when asked in our studies, very few respondents would be able to cite direct experience with such threats or hearing firsthand from someone involved in a security incident. So we have to be mindful of the different messages and perceptions and try to, we need to ensure that we are tailoring our response as humanitarian actors, as political activists, as peace builders to the various perceptions at the different levels of society.
Elena Slavova, Senior Advisor at International Alert, currently working on promoting conflict-sensitive aid for Syrian refugees in Lebanon, joined us from Beirut. Many thanks for being on the show and for your valuable input. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Barakat, do you think the forthcoming president should, and is it a necessity that he will have an agenda for the refugees in Lebanon?
Absolutely. I mean, even let's move back a little bit. When President Sleiman was in power, a delegation from the 14th of March, or Syrian Revolution, went to see President Sleiman to ask him to secure the borders between Lebanon and Syria.
Secure, you mean close or control?
Control.
I see.
In a way that everything will be well organized and
documented.
And documented as it happens in every other country. And we know very, very well who stopped that effort from taking place.
Who? Tell us.
I hate to keep going back to the same subject, but that
Tell
was
us.
Hezbollah.
Why is it in their...
Because it didn't suit their program, because they were planning on interfering in Syria and crossing the border whenever... I mean, we wanted the Lebanese not to interfere in the Syrian war, nor from the Senate, nor from the Shiite. Okay, we support the people's revolutions and to gain their...
freedom and democracy.
Their freedom and their rights. And I think Hezbollah did that with other countries, but not, unfortunately, not with Syria, and we don't know why. All that we want is the Lebanese to be within the border of Lebanon, and the president, supposed to be the next president in Lebanon, he's got a big task on his hand to re-establish order and re-establish authority of institutions. And establish that should be only one army in Lebanon, which is the Lebanese army, and only one border control, which is done by the legal institutions. And that's what we expect from the next president, yes.
And now we are joined by Lebanese histopathologist Dr. Abid Arnaout, working for the British National Health Service. Welcome to our discussion.
Yes, thank you. Thank
Dr.
you. I can hear you well. Okay.
Dr. Arnaout, how would you look at the presidential vacuum in Lebanon now that a year has passed with the parliament failing to elect a new head of state?
Well, I think that the presidential vacuum is a serious problem that the Lebanese need to address as soon as possible. Despite the fact that, you know, the presidential power has significantly reduced in recent years, it's very important that a president has to be elected. And there has been a warning that is given by the United Nations recently, because having a president is a symbol of the unity of a nation, and we really need to have that and really, occupy this vacuum. If we don't do that, we've been given a warning for about 4 years. If we don't do that, I think we will be expecting, the same thing that's happening in Syria and Iraq happening in Lebanon. We really need to understand this very well. I mean, yesterday I was, for example, watching a very nice film, about the golden age of Lebanon. I was very surprised by many Lebanese who think that the presidential vacuum is not that important. I mean,
how is it important in relation to retaining this image of a golden Lebanon, of a glorious Lebanon?
Yes. Well, we, as Lebanon, as a country, and I'm sure maybe Mr. Barakat will agree with me, we are a unique country in the Arab world.
Do you agree, Mr.
We are
Barakat?
we are a multi-religious and multi-sectarian country that we are always lived like that. We are happy to be Christians, Muslims, Druze, all living together with different sects. And this is the ideology, the Lebanese ideology that has always been. We've had our civil war. We will never have another civil war.
Do you think,
we learned from our mistakes.
Are you sure, Dr. Arnaout, this is put to test today, nowadays, with this rift between the Sunnis and the Shia, and the Maronites and the Christians and all other minorities might be dragged into it? So are you sure we will not have another civil war?
I am very optimistic.
And with 1 million refugees in Lebanon?
Look, all the politicians in Lebanon, and all, including Hassan Nasrallah himself, they understand that the need of dialogue is very important. And they all understand at the moment that we need to put the national interest first over our own local politics and local disagreements. If we don't do that, we're going to lose a country, we're going to lose stability and security. And I think this is very important at the moment to be addressed as soon as possible. And although I am a person who is not a politician, I am a doctor who saves lives, but I feel that, there has to be, our politicians has to have a high degree now of emotional intelligence. They have to have a high degree of diplomacy and dialogue in order to resolve all the disputes among them and really, elect a president. It doesn't matter who is the president. It doesn't matter who is going to be a president. What matters, we don't have time really to argue about how an election is going to happen. We have to stick to what we had before. We have to stick to the traditions that we always had. At the moment, we don't have time. Really, time is running, and we don't really have time to argue and talk about, how we want to make Lebanon, in the future. Maybe these reforms may change. But at the moment, there is a definite need to elect a president.
Dr. Arnaout, just like you mentioned a bit earlier that you're a doctor and you save lives. Now tell us a little bit about the humanitarian refugee status and the developments when it comes to their healthcare status over there. Do you think there is hope for those people if they stayed on Lebanese soil?
Well, I mean, having the Syrian refugees at the moment, which is about 1.2 million at the moment, it's estimated, is really very bad at the moment. The Department of Health, despite the improvements they have made in the Lebanese Ministry of Health, in hospitals, in public hospitals, in private hospitals, I don't think we have the capacity or we have the resources to deal with these refugees. And the people who are dealing with these refugees at the moment are the non-government foundations. When you deal with health in a country, you also have, specifically in Lebanon, we have the non-government foundations, which include, the YMCA, the Red Cross. I can hear, for example, things like Rotary Club. Is doing a lot of activities as well. I think all these organizations who are non-government have to help at the moment. And I agree with Mr. Barakat, who was talking about the world need to address all these issues. I think I agree with that. We need to have money, really. We need to have support. We need to have financial support.
Yes, Dr. Abid Arnaout, London-based histopathologist and a graduate of the American University of Beirut. Many thanks for your input today. Thank you.
Not at all.
Mr. Barakat, Do you agree on what Dr. Arnaout just said, and touch a little bit before we end this episode about the refugees, and if you could link this to this presidential void in Lebanon?
I definitely agree with Dr. Arnaout. I know Dr. Arnaout personally, and he's a very respectable member of our community, and he reflects like lots of views of lots of the Lebanese that they're looking forward to see a president elected in the chair. And what distinguished Lebanon from the other countries around around Lebanon, is this mosaic, and is this all those religions living together in peace. Now, you mentioned something very serious, which is everybody sees, like the issue of the Hezbollah and the Sunni of Lebanon. And like that. This is why we keep calling on Hezbollah to come back within the border, to really have Lebanon as the definite country and the final border of the project of work, then at least to integrate with the others without the use of the threat and the weapons and stuff like this. Now, the institutions are the way forward, and the government institutions only. The president is the way forward.
Because they approve of institutions and they sign their projects. Without that, the country is paralyzed.
Then the institutions can be the safety net for all the Lebanese, not just the Christians or the Shiite or the Sunni, for all the Lebanese without exception. We go back to the issue of the refugees. I agree totally with Dr. Arnaout. We don't have the capacities, we don't have the resources, and we don't have the means to carry on.
But as a Lebanese Forces Party and other parties, are they doing anything about it to get more aid into the country?
We are trying our best, of course, to help on that count, because that's a humanitarian issue. And when we see humanitarian issues, we never sit and watch without interfering on doing anything. The only thing is, when we mention organizing the issue of the refugees, it means it's for the best of those refugees and for the best of the Lebanese. So at least we have a clear water.
Thank you. Before it becomes too late, we do hope refugees in Lebanon get more attention from the international communities, NGOs, and of course the Lebanese government and local charities. And as Lebanon's presidential deadlock has entered its second year with no end in sight, it seems it's time foreign officials are expected to launch a flurry of political activity in a new bid to facilitate the election. We do hope they are successful. And as this episode comes to an end, let me thank our guests who joined us today, Dr. Abd Arnaout, London-based consultant histopathologist, and Nadim Baye, Lebanese political commentator, joined us from France, and Elina Slavova, senior advisor at International Alert, spoke to us from Beirut. And our guest here, of course, at the studio, Mr. Barakat of the Lebanese Forces, Joseph Barakat. Thank you very much for being on the show. Stay tuned to Levant TV in London, and I'll be with you again soon on Straight-Forward. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.
Chief Hassan Nasrallah has addressed the nation for the third time in a month, insisting that his fighters would expand their presence in Syria. While Lebanon is officially neutral on the conflict next door, the country has been unable to escape the effects of the war.
Mr. Barakat, some argue that the actual Lebanese Christian parties that complain most about this deadlock when it comes to the presidential vacuum are the ones that caused this mess, as per the journalists in top newspapers in Lebanon. That's what they're saying. Tell us more about this.
I don't think that's truth. What caused this mess is the influence of Hezbollah on the politics in Lebanon, and the way they dictate.
Hezbollah being the main player in this?
The main player in that game, and there is evidence that even the Iranian ambassador was called off few months before the end of term of President Suleiman. Knowing the Iranians, I think they knew that will be no election for a new president in Lebanon. So this is why they had to send an ambassador beforehand, because if they kept it to time that should have been done, then will be no president to receive this ambassador.
I see.
So that's the reason that I say that, because Hezbollah interfered in Syria, in the war in Syria, without referring to anybody else in Lebanon. And it suits Hezbollah not to have a president holding power and managing the crisis through the institutions of Lebanon. So the country with the institutions are practically non-existing.
Mm-hmm.
The only president with the real power at the moment is the Chief of Parliament, Mr. Nabih Berri.
Yes.
Who's
with Al Jazeera, al-Golani predicted that Hezbollah would be defeated after the imminent collapse of the Syrian government. And most importantly, facts and figures tell us it might soon be too late to address a major dilemma in the country, namely the refugee crisis and developments related to their underdeveloped lives. Let me first welcome our guest here at the studio, Mr. Joseph Barakat of the Lebanese Forces in London. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you for having us.
And we will be having and welcoming other guests in due course. Before we delve into our discussion today, let's have a look at this brief report by Saima Jafar.
As Lebanon marked 1 year since its presidential vacuum, United Nations Special Coordinator for Lebanon, Sigrid Kaag, urged the country's feuding political leaders to pick a new president. Kaag stressed that the vacuum had hindered the country's ability to tackle growing security, economic and social problems. Lebanese Prime Minister Tamam Salam also warned that the year-long presidential vacuum is threatening the country's existence, as Christian March 14 lawmakers lobbied the Maronite Patriarch Bashar al-Assad's support to reduce the quorum required for an electoral parliament session. Addressing the nation on the one-year anniversary of the presidential deadlock, Salam warned that the continued vacuum in the top Christian post put the country's very existence into jeopardy and caused heavy damage to Lebanon's sectarian coexistence formula. The presidency has fallen victim to political deadlock rooted in Lebanese rivalries that have been complicated by competition between regional states, notably Iran and Saudi Arabia, which have a decisive influence over regional politics. A country of just over 4 million people, Lebanon is also overwhelmed with the influx of Syrian refugees fleeing the war. UN Special Envoy for Global Education Gordon Brown has backed a $100 million call for the international community to fund formal public education for 100,000 more Syrian refugee children in Lebanon, with 4 months to the start of the new school year. According to UNHCR estimates, there are nearly 400,000 school-aged children refugees in Lebanon. Meanwhile, Hezbollah's
Hello, welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's political talk show. Amongst the important anniversaries marked in Lebanon Monday were the passing of 1 year since President Michel Sleiman left office, in addition to 365 days of non-stop talk and no action on electing a successor. Politicians of all types, as well as representatives of civil society and people in the street, have made their views known. The 1 year mark came amid few signs that the vacancy would be addressed soon, but pessimism is on the rise, and Lebanon has been dubbed the Republic of Shame. Meanwhile, Hezbollah is doomed to fail in Qalamun and throughout Syria, and that's according to Abu Muhammad al-Golani, the leader of the Nusra Front, as he said in a televised interview